The frozen Delaware River cracked like musket fire beneath the weight of history on the night of December 25, 1776. General George Washington stood at the bow of the lead Durham boat, his weathered hands gripping the gunwale as ice chunks scraped against the wooden hull. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled in the bitter cold, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the moonless night. Few believed they would survive the next 48 hours, let alone change the course of a revolution. The American cause hung by the thinnest of threads. Just weeks earlier, Washington's army had been in full retreat across New Jersey, leaving behind a trail of deserters and despair. The enlistments of most soldiers would expire with the dying year, and Congress had fled Philadelphia in panic. British General William Howe commanded over 30,000 troops positioned throughout New Jersey, while Hessian mercenaries under Colonel Johann Gottlob Raoul occupied the strategic town of Trenton. The revolution appeared to be breathing its last. Washington knew that conventional military wisdom dictated retreat and regrouping. His officers whispered of surrender, and even his most loyal commanders questioned the sanity of attacking professional European soldiers with farmers and shopkeepers. But the Virginia planter-turned-general understood something his critics did not. The American cause needed a miracle, not military orthodoxy. It was documented in historian David Hackett, Fisher's acclaimed work Washington's Crossing. The general had already decided that audacity, not caution, would determine the fate of the rebellion. The crossing itself became an epic of human endurance. Jagged ice floes threatened to crush the boats, while a nor'easter unleashed sleet and snow that turned the river into a maelstrom. Captain Alexander Hamilton, barely 19 years old, commanded one of the artillery batteries being ferried across the treacherous waters. The young West Indian immigrant watched seasoned soldiers weep from the cold as they struggled to keep their powder dry and their weapons functional. By 3 in the morning of December 26th, the last soldier had reached the New Jersey. Sure, Washington's plan called for a dawn attack on Trenton, but the weather had delayed everything. The element of surprise, crucial to their slim chances of success, seemed lost. Many officers urged abandonment of the mission, arguing that daylight would expose their ragged force to devastating counterattacks. The password for the night, victory or death, suddenly seemed prophetic in the worst possible way. Yet Washington pressed forward through the howling storm. He divided his force into 2 columns, with General Nathanael Greene leading the main attack down the Pennington Road, while General John Sullivan advanced along the River Road. The general himself rode, with Greene's column, his blue military cloak heavy with ice and snow. Behind them trudged an army that looked more like refugees than soldiers, their feet leaving bloody tracks in the snow. At 8 in the morning, as the storm reached its peak fury, the attack began. The Hessians, celebrating their Christmas victory over inferior American forces, were caught completely off guard. Colonel Raoul had dismissed warnings of American activity, confident that no army could move in such weather. His fatal underestimation of American determination would cost him his life in hand. Washington, his first major victory, the Battle of Trenton, lasted less than an hour, but its psychological impact reverberated across 2 continents. 900 Hessian prisoners marched back across the Delaware, while American casualties numbered fewer than 5 men. More importantly, the victory breathed new life into the revolutionary cause. Soldiers who had planned to desert instead re-enlisted, and wavering colonial assemblies renewed their support for independence. But Washington understood that one victory, however dramatic, could not sustain a revolution. As he planned his next move in the comfortable quarters of Trenton, the general already envisioned a follow-up stroke that would transform tactical success into strategic advantage. The road to Princeton beckoned, promising either the consolidation of American gains or the complete destruction of his reinvigorated army. News of the Trenton victory spread through the colonies like wildfire. But General Washington knew that celebration was premature. Within hours of the battle's end, British commanders throughout New Jersey began mobilizing their forces for a crushing counterattack. General Charles Cornwallis, recalled from his planned voyage to England, assembled 8,000 veteran troops to recapture Trenton and destroy Washington's audacious army once and for all. The American position grew increasingly precarious as December waned. Washington's force, swollen by militia, reinforcements, and re-enlisted Continentals, now numbered approximately 5,000 men. However, most remained poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and demoralized by months of defeat. The general established defensive positions south of Assunpink Creek, using the natural barrier to anchor his line, while Continental artillery commanded the stone bridge that provided the only direct route into Trenton. On January 1st, 1777, Cornwallis began his methodical advance from Princeton with overwhelming force. The British general, nicknamed the Fighting Earl for his aggressive tactics, had no intention of allowing Washington to escape again. His columns moved with mechanical precision down the post road, their scarlet uniforms a stark contrast against the snow-covered New Jersey countryside. Hessian Jeegers and British light infantry screened the advance, while artillery pieces rumbled forward to support what promised to be the final crushing of American resistance. Washington deployed his forces with characteristic attention to terrain and timing. General Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen conducted a masterful delaying action, using stone walls and farm buildings to slow the British advance. Each calculated withdrawal drew Cornwallis deeper into the trap Washington was preparing, though. Few American officers understood their commander's ultimate intentions. As recorded in the Princeton Battlefield Society's extensive research, the day-long running battle showcased the evolving tactical sophistication of the Continental Army. By late afternoon, British forces had pushed the Americans back to their main defensive line along Assunpink Creek. 3 separate assaults on the stone bridge failed as Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery and other artillery units poured devastating fire into the attacking columns. The sight of British grenadiers retreating in disorder sent cheers through the American ranks, but Washington remained grimly focused on the larger strategic picture. Cornwallis commanded nearly twice as many men, and British reinforcements continued, arriving from New Brunswick and other garrison towns. As darkness fell on January 2nd, the British general made a fateful decision. Confident that Washington was trapped with his back to the Delaware River, Cornwallis ordered his exhausted troops to make camp and prepare for a final assault at dawn. "We've got the old fox safe now," he reportedly told his staff officers. "We'll go over and bag him in the morning." The Earl's confidence reflected the conventional military wisdom of the 18th century. No rational commander would risk everything on another desperate gamble. But Washington was already planning exactly such a gamble. As his officers gathered for their evening council of war, the general outlined a plan so audacious that several colonels initially thought he was joking. Rather than attempt another river crossing or await inevitable destruction, Washington proposed to slip away in the darkness and strike at Princeton, where a smaller British force guarded crucial supplies and communications. The maneuver would require perfect timing, absolute silence, and more luck than any army deserved. The logistics of the night march seemed impossible. The army would need to muffle wheels, hooves, and equipment while navigating unfamiliar roads in complete darkness. Any delay, any discovery by British patrols, would result in the destruction of the Continental Army caught between Cornwallis's main force and the Princeton garrison. Moreover, the soldiers were exhausted from the day's fighting and had eaten little for 24 hours, yet as Washington explained his reasoning, the desperate nature of their situation became clear to every officer present. Retreat across the Delaware would abandon New Jersey to British control and likely end the Revolution. Standing to fight would result in certain annihilation by superior numbers. Only by attacking could they hope to maintain the initiative gained at Trenton and potentially transform the strategic balance of the entire war. At midnight on January 2nd, 1877, the Continental Army began one of the most daring maneuvers in military history. General Washington had ordered his men to wrap their wagon wheels in rags and tie cloth around their horses' hooves to muffle the sound of movement. Campfires continued burning along Assunpink Creek, maintained by skeleton crews, who would slip away just before dawn. creating the illusion that the entire American force remained in position. The march to Princeton required navigating the Quaker Road, a little-used route that wound through frozen farmland and dense woodlands. Captain John Fitzgerald, one of Washington's aides-de-camp, later described the eerie procession of shadow figures moving through the darkness, their breath forming clouds that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. Artillery pieces, their wheels wrapped in canvas, rolled forward with ghostly silence while infantry columns maintained perfect discipline despite their exhaustion. Washington rode at the head of his army, his intimate knowledge of Virginia plantation management proving invaluable in coordinating such a complex nighttime movement. The general had learned to move large groups of people and equipment efficiently during his years managing Mount Vernon, skills that now served the cause of independence. Behind him, Generals Nathaniel Greene and Hugh Mercer commanded the two main divisions, while militia forces under General John Cadwalader provided additional strength for the risky venture. The weather, which had been the Americans' ally at Trenton, now turned treacherous. The temperature dropped well below freezing, creating patches of ice that threatened to send artillery pieces sliding off the narrow road. Soldiers, without proper boots, wrapped their feet in rags, leaving bloody traces in the snow that marked their passage. Many men had not eaten in 36 hours, sustained only by the promise of victory and the fear of capture. As recorded in Thomas Fleming's comprehensive study, The Strategy of Victory, the march revealed the growing professionalism of the Continental Army. Officers maintained strict noise discipline, while sergeants ensured that no man fell behind or wandered from the column. The army that had fled across New Jersey in November now demonstrated the cohesion and determination of veteran soldiers, transformed by hardship and recent success into an effective fighting force. By 4 a.m, advance scouts reported that Princeton lay just ahead, its British garrison apparently unaware of the approaching danger. Washington called a brief halt to rest his exhausted men and make final preparations for the assault. The general's plan called for a 3-pronged attack that would overwhelm the enemy. Before they could organize effective resistance or send word to Cornwallis at Trenton, General Hugh Mercer would lead his brigade along the back road to capture the stone bridge over Stony Brook, cutting off the British line of retreat toward Trenton. Meanwhile, General Sullivan would advance directly into Princeton to secure the main body of enemy forces. Washington himself would command the reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough or rescue any column that countered serious resistance. The approaching dawn brought both opportunity and peril. Daylight would allow the Americans to coordinate their attack more effectively, but it would also expose their movements to British observation. Moreover, Cornwallis would soon discover the empty American positions at Assunpink Creek and begin pursuit with his overwhelming force. The window for success grew narrower with each passing minute, as the first gray light of January 3rd began, filtering through the trees. Washington's army prepared for the battle that would determine not just their own fate, but the future direction of the Revolutionary War. The soldiers, many still teenagers, checked their muskets and fixed bayonets with the grim determination of men who understood they were making history. Behind them lay the frozen Delaware and the ashes of their previous defeats. Ahead waited either glorious victory or final destruction. General raised his hand to signal the advance, and 5,000 Americans stepped forward into legend. Princeton awaited, unaware that the next few hours would reshape the strategic landscape of North America and prove that citizen soldiers could defeat the world's most professional army through courage, cunning, and unwavering commitment to their cause. Dawn broke cold and clear over Princeton as General Hugh Mercer's brigade advanced through the frost-covered fields towards Stony Brook. The Virginia general, a close friend of Washington since their days fighting together in the French and Indian War, led 350 men in what would prove to be the opening act of a battle that would echo through history. Rays revealed British sentries near the stone bridge, the first sign that the enemy remained unaware of the approaching Continental force. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood commanded the British forces in Princeton, capable officer who had served with distinction in the Caribbean campaigns. On the morning of January 3, 1777, Mawhood was preparing to march, 2 regiments toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis when his advance guard spotted suspicious movement in the distance. What he initially dismissed as local farmers quickly resolved into organized military columns, advancing with clear hostile intent. The first shots of the Battle of Princeton rang out near the William Clark Farm as British light infantry encountered Mercer's skirmishers. The Virginia general immediately recognized the tactical situation. His smaller force faced professional troops in open ground, precisely the kind of engagement that had destroyed so many American units throughout the previous year. However, Mercer also understood that retreat would expose Washington's entire plan and doom the Continental Army to destruction. Mohud deployed his forces with textbook precision, forming the 17th Regiment of Foot into line while ordering his artillery to unlimber and target the approaching Americans. The British commander had fought in multiple colonial campaigns and held typical European contempt for colonial military capabilities. The disaster at Trenton, he believed, resulted from Hessian incompetence rather than American skill. He would demonstrate how proper British soldiers handled rebellious colonists. The firefight that erupted across the frozen fields showcased the evolution of American tactics since the early disasters of Long Island and Fort Washington. Mercer's men advanced in loose order, using stone walls and farm buildings for cover while maintaining disciplined volley fire. Captain John Fleming of the 1st Virginia Regiment later described the surreal beauty of the morning combat, with musket smoke drifting across snow-covered ground, while the winter sun cast long shadows between the opposing forces, as documented in the detailed battlefield archaeology conducted by Princeton University. Engagement quickly developed into a conventional European-style battle. Both sides formed linear formations and exchanged devastating volleys at close range, with casualties mounting rapidly on both sides.
Ow.
The crack of muskets mixed with the deeper boom of artillery as British 6-pounders hurled grapeshot into the American ranks. General Mercer, mounted on his gray charger, rode along his battle line, encouraging his men and directing their fire. The 56-year-old physician-turned-soldier had survived Culloden and multiple frontier campaigns. But Princeton would test his courage as never before. When his horse fell wounded, Mercer continued fighting on foot until British bayonets brought him down near a massive oak tree that still stands on the battlefield today. The death of their beloved commander shattered Mercer's brigade, and the men began falling back in disorder. British infantry, sensing victory, pressed forward with fixed bayonets while Mohud shouted orders to exploit the breakthrough. For several crucial minutes, it appeared that the Battle of Princeton would end in another devastating American defeat, destroying Washington's carefully planned offensive and probably ending the Revolution. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding his battery of New York artillery, witnessed the collapse of Mercer's line from his position with the main American force. The young officer immediately recognized the crisis and began preparing his guns to cover a general retreat. Around him, Continental soldiers watched in dismay as their comrades fled across the frozen fields, pursued by triumphant British infantry. But Washington had anticipated this possibility. As the Virginia planter-turned-general spurred his horse toward the sound of gunfire, he carried with him not just the hopes of his struggling army, but the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent managing crises and turning setbacks into opportunities. The Battle of Princeton was far from over, and its outcome would depend on the next crucial decisions made by both commanders. In the swirling chaos of 18th century warfare, General George Washington heard the crash of musketry from Mercer's position and immediately grasped the tactical crisis unfolding near Stony Brook, spurring his white charger forward. The commander-in-chief rode directly toward the sound of battle, his blue military cloak streaming behind him as he covered the frozen ground between his reserve position and the collapsing American line. Behind him galloped his staff officers, their faces grim with the knowledge that the entire Princeton gamble hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The sight that greeted Washington as he crested the small ridge overlooking the battlefield was nearly catastrophic. Mercer's Virginians were streaming back in disorder, many carrying wounded comrades, while British infantry pressed forward with bayonets gleaming in the morning sunlight. Lieutenant Colonel Mohud had deployed his forces with professional competence. and his 17th Regiment of Foot was executing a textbook advance that threatened to roll up the entire American attack. Captain John Hamilton, commanding a company of Philadelphia militia, later described Washington's arrival on the scene as transformative. The general's mere presence seemed to steady the retreating soldiers, many of whom had served under him during the disastrous New York campaign, but had never seen their commander expose himself so directly to enemy fire. Washington's decision to personally rally the troops reflected both his understanding of military psychology and his recognition that the revolution itself hung in the balance. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," Washington shouted to the fleeing soldiers. "We shall presently have a warm piece of work." His words, delivered in the calm Virginia accent that had commanded respect in the colonial legislature, cut through the panic and confusion of retreat. Gradually, individual soldiers began turning to face the enemy, their officers working desperately to reform scattered companies into fighting formations. The critical moment came when Washington positioned himself directly between the opposing forces, within musket range of both American and British lines. Staff officers pleaded with him to withdraw to safety, but the general understood that nothing less than personal example could salvage the situation. As recorded in the extensive correspondence preserved at Mount Vernon, Washington's aide-de-camp, Colonel John Fitzgerald later wrote that he covered his eyes, unable to watch what seemed certain to be the death of both his commander and the Revolution. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery had unlimbered on slightly higher ground, and the young officer immediately recognized the opportunity presented by Washington's intervention. Ordering his gunners to load with grape shot, Hamilton prepared to pour devastating fire into the British ranks at point-blank range. The coordination between infantry and artillery that would later characterize American victories was beginning to emerge under the pressure of desperate combat. The British advance faltered as Continental reinforcements arrived on the field. General Sullivan's New Hampshire men appeared on the American right flank, while militia units from Pennsylvania and New Jersey extended the battle line toward Princeton itself. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, observing the developing tactical situation with professional eye, recognized that his isolated force now faced overwhelming numbers, with no possibility of immediate support. Washington, still mounted between the battle lines, drew his sword and pointed toward the British position. "It's a fine fox chase, my boys," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen field. The hunting metaphor resonated with soldiers who understood that they had become the hunters rather than the hunted, transforming months of retreat and defeat into aggressive pursuit of a professional European army. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical one. Continental soldiers who had fled across New Jersey in November now advanced steadily against British bayonets, their confidence restored by recent victory and inspired leadership. The citizen soldiers were learning that they could face European professionals on equal terms when properly led and adequately motivated. As the American battle line moved forward, British resistance began to crumble. Hood's men, veteran soldiers, who had served in multiple colonial campaigns, found themselves outnumbered and outflanked by an enemy they had been taught to despise. The professional competence that had characterized British military operations throughout the early war was proving insufficient against American determination backed by sound tactical leadership. The Battle of Princeton was reaching its climax, and with it, the broader strategic transformation that would reshape the entire revolutionary conflict. The British collapse at Princeton unfolded with stunning rapidity once Lieutenant Colonel Mahood recognized that his isolated force faced destruction. The 17th Regiment of Foot, which had advanced so confidently against Mercer's retreating Virginians, now found itself surrounded by overwhelming American numbers and subjected to devastating artillery fire from multiple directions. Captain Hamilton's battery poured grapeshot into their ranks, while Continental infantry pressed forward with fixed bayonets. Their earlier panic transformed into aggressive pursuit. Mahood, a professional soldier who understood the realities of 18th-century warfare, ordered an immediate retreat toward the post road and potential safety with Cornwallis's approaching force. However, the British commander had underestimated both the tactical skill of his opponents and the speed with which Washington could exploit success. American forces had positioned themselves to block the most direct escape routes, forcing the retreating British into increasingly desperate attempts to reach friendly lines. The pursuit through Princeton itself became a running battle that demonstrated the Continental Army's growing tactical sophistication. General Sullivan's New Hampshire troops entered the town from the north, while militia units sealed off potential escape routes to the east and south. British soldiers, many of whom had never experienced defeat at the hands of colonial forces, found themselves trapped in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every movement. Nassau Hall, the imposing stone building that housed the College of New Jersey, became a focal point of resistance as British forces attempted to establish a defensive position. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery pieces, now repositioned in the college yard, opened fire on the building at point-blank range, according to local tradition preserved by the Princeton Historical Society, when cannonball passed through a portrait of King George II, a symbolic destruction of royal authority that would be celebrated throughout the colonies. The fighting around Nassau Hall showcased the increasingly professional conduct of American forces, rather than pursuing a chaotic massacre of fleeing enemies. Continental officers maintained discipline while accepting the surrender of British soldiers who laid down their arms. Washington's emphasis on proper military conduct, developed during his Virginia militia service, was transforming citizen soldiers into a legitimate army capable of operating according to established European conventions. Lieutenant Colonel Mohood managed to escape with approximately 100 men, but his 2 regiments were effectively destroyed as fighting formations. Nearly 300 British soldiers became prisoners, while American casualties numbered fewer than 30 men. The tactical victory was complete, but its strategic implications would prove even more significant for the broader revolutionary cause as the sounds of combat faded across Princeton. Washington faced a crucial decision that would determine whether his victory became a mere tactical success or a strategic transformation. General Cornwallis was undoubtedly marching from Trenton with overwhelming force. The Continental Army remained vulnerable to destruction if caught in open country by superior numbers. The temptation to retreat across the Delaware with prisoners and captured supplies was enormous, particularly given the Army's exhaustion after 36 hours of continuous operations. Instead, Washington chose to demonstrate the strategic vision that would ultimately secure American independence. Rather than retreating, he ordered his army to continue advancing toward New Brunswick, where British supply depots contained the equipment and provisions needed to sustain extended military operations. The general understood that successive victories were necessary to maintain revolutionary momentum and convince European powers that American independence was achievable. The march toward New Brunswick revealed the complete transformation of American military capabilities. Since the dark days of November, soldiers who had fled in panic across New Jersey now advanced confidently through enemy territory, their morale restored and their confidence in their leadership unshakable. The Continental Army was becoming a professional force capable of sustained offensive operations against European opponents. However, practical considerations ultimately forced Washington to modify his ambitious plans. His exhausted soldiers had been marching and fighting for nearly 2 days without adequate rest or food. Moreover, intelligence reports suggested that British reinforcements were converging on New Brunswick from multiple directions, creating the possibility of another tactical disaster if the Americans pressed too far too fast. The decision to halt the advance and withdraw to winter quarters at Morristown would prove strategically brilliant, establishing a secure base for future operations while preserving the gains achieved through 2 dramatic victories. The Continental Army's withdrawal to winter quarters at Morristown marked the end of what historians would later recognize as the most strategically significant 10 days in American military history. General Washington's twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had accomplished far more than tactical success against isolated enemy forces. They had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Revolutionary War and demonstrated to the world that American independence was not merely a colonial rebellion, but a legitimate cause capable of defeating European military power. The immediate strategic consequences were dramatic and far-reaching. British forces, which had controlled most of New Jersey following their autumn successes, now found themselves confined to a few coastal enclaves around New York City and Newport. Lord Cornwallis, who had been preparing to crush the remnants of Washington's army, instead found himself conducting a humiliating retreat that abandoned months of territorial gains. The psychological impact on British commanders was profound, forcing them to completely reconsider their assumptions about American military capabilities. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, received news of the Princeton disaster, while planning spring operations designed to end the rebellion through decisive military action. Instead, he was forced to adopt a defensive strategy that conceded the initiative to Washington and acknowledged that the Continental Army had become a legitimate opponent worthy of professional respect. In the British National Archives, Stau's dispatches to London reflected his growing recognition that the American conflict would require massive reinforcements and extended military commitment. The international implications proved equally significant. For the revolutionary cause, European courts, particularly in France and Spain, had been watching American military performance carefully while considering whether to risk war with Britain by supporting colonial independence. The disasters of 1876 had convinced most European observers that the rebellion would collapse within months, making support both unnecessary and dangerous. Princeton changed these calculations overnight. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, received detailed reports of Washington's victories through intelligence networks that had been monitoring American military capabilities. Since the beginning of the conflict, a demonstration that citizen soldiers could defeat professional European armies in conventional battle provided exactly the evidence that French strategists needed to justify open support for American independence. Secret negotiations for French military assistance, which had been proceeding slowly since 1776, accelerated dramatically following Princeton. The domestic impact within the American colonies was equally transformative. State governments that had been reluctant to provide men and supplies for what appeared to be a losing cause now competed to demonstrate their patriotic commitment. Recruitment, which had been catastrophically difficult throughout the autumn disasters, suddenly became manageable as young men responded to proof that American forces could achieve victory against overwhelming odds. Perhaps most importantly, Princeton established the strategic template that would ultimately secure American independence. Washington had demonstrated that conventional military wisdom which favored defensive operations by inferior forces could be replaced by audacious offensive action that seized the initiative and exploited enemy weaknesses. The Continental Army would never again be reduced to purely defensive operations, instead maintaining offensive capability that kept British forces constantly off balance. The battle also revealed the emerging character of American military leadership. Officers like Alexander Hamilton, Nathaniel Greene, and Hugh Mercer had shown that colonial commanders could match their European counterparts in tactical skill and strategic vision. The professional competence displayed at Princeton provided the foundation for the military leadership that would ultimately secure independence at Yorktown. General Washington's role in the transformation was central but not exclusive. His personal courage in rallying broken formations had been crucial. But equally important was his strategic vision that recognized the need for successive victories to maintain revolutionary momentum. The Virginia planter had evolved into a military commander capable of grand strategic thinking while maintaining the tactical flexibility necessary for battlefield success. The frozen fields around Princeton had witnessed more than a military victory. They had seen the birth of a new kind of warfare that combined European tactical discipline with American innovation and determination. The revolution would continue for 6 more years, with many setbacks and near disasters still to come. However, January 3, 1777, Sped established that American independence was not merely possible, but probable, transforming a colonial rebellion into a war of national liberation that would reshape the Atlantic world. Historical context and battle details referenced from David Hackett, Fisher's Washington's Crossing and Princeton Battlefield Society Archives.